The moment I walked through the front door of our house in Willowbrook Heights, I saw him standing in our bedroom doorway with my suitcase in his hands, a smug smile plastered across his face. "Delilah," my husband Garrett announced with the confidence of a man who thought he held all the cards, "I've already packed your things. It's time for you to go. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." What Garrett didn't know was that I had spent that entire morning carefully packing his belongings into boxes and storing them in the garage. While he was busy at his so-called business meeting with his secretary Vivienne, I was 3 steps ahead, preparing for the confrontation that would change both our lives forever. You see, I had discovered his affair weeks ago, and unlike the naive woman he thought he married 8 years earlier, I had learned to play chess while he was still playing checkers. But let me back up and tell you how I ended up in this position. A position where my own husband felt entitled to kick me out of the house I had helped build, the life I had sacrificed everything to create. My name is Delilah Rosewood, and for the past 8 years I had been living what I thought was the perfect life in our suburban community of Willowbrook Heights. Garrett Thornfield and I had met during our final year at Riverside University, where I was completing my degree in marketing while he studied business administration. Back then, he was charming, ambitious, and seemed to worship the ground I walked on. He would bring me coffee during my late-night study sessions, surprise me with handwritten notes between classes, and constantly tell me how lucky he felt to have found someone as brilliant and beautiful as me. After graduation, we moved to Willowbrook Heights together, a picturesque town about 30 minutes outside the city. Garrett landed a position at Meridian Financial Group, a prestigious investment firm downtown, while I started working at Brightwater Marketing Agency, a small but growing company that specialized in digital campaigns for local businesses. Life felt full of possibility. We got married 2 years later in a beautiful ceremony at the Willowbrook Country Club, surrounded by friends and family. I remember feeling like the luckiest woman alive as I walked down the aisle toward Garrett, who was dabbing at his eyes with a handkerchief, overwhelmed with emotion. His best man, Trevor Ashford, later joked during his speech that he had never seen Garrett cry before that day, not even when their favorite team lost the championship. The early years of our marriage were everything I had dreamed of. Garrett was attentive, supportive, and genuinely seemed to value my opinions and ambitions. When I got promoted to senior marketing strategist at Brightwater, he threw me a surprise celebration dinner. When I suggested we start looking for a house, he spent weekends driving around different neighborhoods with me, patiently viewing property after property until we found our dream home on Maplewood Drive. The house was a beautiful 2-story colonial with white shutters, a wraparound porch, and a backyard perfect for the children we planned to have someday. It needed some work, but Garrett and I spent our first year there renovating together. I painted the kitchen a warm yellow while he refinished the hardwood floors. We planted a garden together, chose furniture together, and slowly turned our house into a home that reflected both our personality. But somewhere around year 4 of our marriage, things began to shift in ways so subtle that I almost missed them entirely. It started with small things that I initially dismissed as normal relationship evolution. Garrett began working later hours, explaining that he was up for a promotion at Meridian Financial and needed to prove his dedication. The romantic dinners became less frequent, replaced by quick takeout meals eaten while he scrolled through his phone. Our weekend adventures exploring antique shops and hiking trails in nearby Clearwater Valley gradually gave way to Garrett spending Saturdays at the office or playing golf with his colleagues. When I brought up my concerns, Garrett would look at me with that patient expression he reserved for when he thought I was being unnecessarily emotional. "Delilah, darling," he would say, using the pet name that once made my heart flutter, "I'm doing this for us. The harder I work now, the better our future will be. Don't you want financial security? Don't you want to be able to afford the lifestyle we've always talked about?" And because I loved him, because I trusted him completely, I swallowed my doubts and told myself he was right. After all, hadn't he always been the more practical one in our relationship? Hadn't his steady nature balanced out my more impulsive tendencies? So I adapted. I stopped suggesting weekend getaways and started planning them around his schedule instead. I learned to have dinner ready whenever he finally made it home, even if that meant eating alone and reheating his portion at 9 or 10 o'clock at night. When he missed my company's annual holiday party because of a client emergency, I made excuses to my colleagues and attended alone, smiling and pretending everything was perfectly fine. The physical distance followed the emotional distance. Our conversations became increasingly superficial, focused on household logistics, rather than dreams and aspirations. Garrett seemed perpetually distracted, always checking his phone during meals or stepping out to take important calls that couldn't wait. Our intimate moments became sporadic and mechanical, lacking the passion and connection that had once defined our relationship. By year 6, I felt like I was living with a polite stranger who happened to share my last name and mortgage payment. The worst part wasn't the loneliness, though that was certainly painful. The worst part was how Garrett had begun treating me like an employee rather than a partner. He would leave me lists of household tasks to complete, critique how I managed our social calendar, and make unilateral decisions about major purchases or vacation plans. When I tried to discuss these issues with him, he would dismiss my concerns with a wave of his hand and a condescending smile. "You're being overly sensitive, Delilah," became his standard response to any complaint I raised. "I'm under a lot of pressure at work right now. Once things settle down, we'll have more time to focus on us." But things never seemed to settle down. There was always another project, another client, another crisis that demanded his immediate attention and justified his emotional absence from our marriage. Looking back now, I realized that I had become completely invisible in my own life, existing solely to maintain the facade of our perfect marriage, while Garrett pursued whatever it was that had captured his interest outside our home. I was like a ghost haunting the halls of the house we had once filled with laughter and love, going through the motions of being a wife while my husband systematically erased me from his priorities. What I didn't know then, as I stood in that bedroom doorway watching Garrett hold my packed suitcase with such casual cruelty, was that I was about to reclaim every ounce of power I had unknowingly surrendered over the years. The woman he thought he could discard so easily was about to remind him exactly who he had married, and what he was about to lose. The emergency that shattered my carefully constructed denial happened on a rainy Thursday evening in October, 3 weeks before I would find Garrett standing in our bedroom with my suitcase. I had been battling a severe case of food poisoning for 2 days, barely able to keep water down, let alone manage my responsibilities at Brightwater Market. My assistant Rebecca Hayworth had been covering for me, but there was a crucial client presentation for Westfield Electronics that only I could handle, a presentation that could secure our agency's biggest contract to date. Lying in bed with a fever of 102 degrees, I called Garrett's office at Meridian Financial, desperate for help. I needed him to drive me to the Brightwater office so I could grab the presentation files from my computer and email them to Rebecca. It was a simple request that would take maybe 30 minutes of his time, but it could save my career and our agency's future. "Meridian Financial Group, this is Vivienne speaking," came the sultry voice I had heard countless times when calling Garrett's office. Vivienne Clark had been his secretary for almost 2 years. A stunning brunette with a figure that turned heads and a voice like warm honey. I had met her several times at company functions, where she always seemed to hover near Garrett with an attentiveness that went beyond professional courtesy. "Hi Vivienne, it's Delilah. I need to speak with Garrett urgently, please. It's a family emergency." There was a pause, followed by what sounded suspiciously like a muffled giggle. "Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. Thornfield, but Garrett is in a very important meeting with potential investors. He specifically asked not to be disturbed for anything short of, well, I suppose a real emergency." The way she said real emergency made my stomach clench with something other than nausea. There was an intimacy in her tone, a casual dismissal that suggested she felt comfortable making decisions about my husband's availability. "Vivienne, I have a 102-degree fever and I'm about to lose the biggest client my company has ever had a chance to land. This is a real emergency. Please put me through to him." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear voices in the background, and what distinctly sounded like Garrett's laugh, not his professional laugh, but the genuine delighted laugh I hadn't heard directed at me in over a year. I'll give him the message, and ask him to call you back when his meeting concludes," Vivienne finally said, her voice carrying a note of barely concealed annoyance. I waited, and waited. An hour passed, then 2. The Westfield presentation was scheduled for the next morning, and with each passing minute, my chances of salvaging the situation grew slimmer. Finally I called again. Meridian Financial Group, Vivienne speaking. Vivienne, it's Delilah again. Did Garrett get my mess? I really need to speak with him. This time, there was no attempt to hide the irritation in her voice. Mrs. Thornfield, I did relay your message, Garrett said. Well, he said he's sure you can handle whatever the situation is. He has complete faith in your ability. The dismissal hit me like a physical blow. Here I was, literally sick and desperately needing my husband's help, and he couldn't even be bothered to take a 2-minute phone call. But what made it worse was the way Vivienne delivered the message, with a sort of smug satisfaction that suggested she enjoyed being the gatekeeper between me and my own husband. Is he still in his meeting? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Oh no, the meeting ended about an hour ago. He's just busy with some follow-up paperwork. Very important stuff, you understand. That's when I heard it in the background, the sound of Garrett's voice saying, Viv, where did you put my, followed by an abrupt silence, as if someone had suddenly realized they were too close to the phone. Viv, he called her. In 8 years of marriage, Garrett had never used a nickname for anyone. He barely used my actual name, preferring generic terms like honey or darling that could apply to anyone. But here he was, using an intimate diminutive for his secretary while refusing to take an emergency call from his wife. You know what, Vivienne? I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. Please tell Garrett that his wife called with an emergency, and his secretary was very helpful in making sure he didn't have to be bothered with something as trivial as his marriage. I hung up before she could respond. Somehow, driven by a combination of fever-induced delirium and sheer determination, I managed to drag myself to my car and drive to the Brightwater office. The 10-minute journey felt like an hour and I had to pull over twice to be sick, but I made it. Rebecca met me there, took one look at my pale, sweaty face, and immediately took charge of getting the presentation files while I collapsed in my office chair. The next morning, despite still feeling like I'd been hit by a truck, I delivered the Westfield presentation via video call from my home office. We got the contract, a 3-year deal worth over $2 million that would transform Brightwater marketing from a small local agency into a regional powerhouse. When Garrett finally came home that evening, nearly 12 hours after I had desperately tried to reach him, he found me sitting at our kitchen table with a cup of tea and my laptop, putting the finishing touches on the contract detail. Hey darling, he said casually, loosening his tie as he walked through the door. How are you feeling? Vivienne mentioned you called the office yesterday. The audacity was breathtaking. He stood there, looking perfectly comfortable and well-rested, asking about my health as if he hadn't completely abandoned me when I needed him most. I'm fine, I replied quietly, not looking up from my screen. Just closed the biggest deal in my company's history, no big deal. Garrett moved to the refrigerator, helping himself to leftover Chinese takeout. That's great, honey. I knew you'd handle whatever it was. You're so capable, as if my capability was an excuse for his neglect, as if being strong meant I didn't deserve support, comfort or basic human decency from the man who had promised to love me in sickness and in health. Garrett, I said, finally looking up at him as he microwaved his dinner. Where were you yesterday when I called? He didn't even pause in his food preparation. I told you, I was in meetings all day, very important potential investors. These deals don't happen overnight, Delilah. Sometimes sacrifice is required. And what exactly am I sacrificing? For the first time, he looked directly at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. It wasn't guilt or embarrassment or even irritation. It was indifference, complete total indifference to my pain, my needs, my existence. You're sacrificing for our future, he said in the tone one might use to explain something obvious to a child, for the life we're building together. But as I watched him eat his reheated Chinese food while scrolling through his phone, ignoring me completely despite the fact that I had just shared news of a major professional triumph, I realized something that would change everything. Garrett wasn't building a life with me. He was building a life that happened to include me as a convenient accessory, someone to maintain his home and social standing while he pursued whatever, or whoever truly captured his interest. That night, as Garrett slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, and made a decision that would prove to be the first step in reclaiming my life. I was going to find out exactly what my husband was sacrificing our marriage for. And 3 weeks later, when I discovered the truth about Garrett and Vivienne, I would be ready to show him exactly what sacrifice really meant. The investigation into my husband's double life began the very next day after that humiliating phone call with Vivienne. I had always prided myself on being straightforward and trusting, the kind of person who took people at face value and believed in the best of human nature. But 8 years of marriage to Garrett had taught me that sometimes survival requires developing skills you never thought you'd need. My first instinct was to confront Garrett directly, but something held me back. Maybe it was the way he had looked at me the night before, that cold, detached expression that suggested I was nothing more than an inconvenience. Or maybe it was years of having my concerns dismissed and my instincts questioned. Whatever the reason, I decided that this time, I would gather facts before making accusations. The opportunity came sooner than expected. That Saturday morning, Garrett announced he would be spending the day at the office, working on a critical merger proposal that required his immediate attention. He kissed my forehead absently, the same way one might pat a dog, and headed out the door with his briefcase and laptop bag. "I'll probably be there most of the day," he called over his shoulder. "Don't wait up if I'm late." An hour after he left, I found myself driving toward downtown Meridian, my heart pounding with a mixture of determination and dread. I had never spied on my husband before, had never even considered it, but something deep in my gut told me that everything I thought I knew about my marriage was about to change forever. The Meridian Financial Building was a sleek glass tower that dominated the city's financial district. I parked across the street in the lot of a small cafe called Brewster's Corner, positioning myself where I could see both the main entrance and the underground parking garage. If Garrett was really working, his car would be there, and I would see him coming and going like any other dedicated employee. I waited for 2 hours, nursing coffee after coffee, and pretending to read a magazine while keeping my eyes fixed on the building entrance. Office workers came and went, some I recognized from company parties, others complete strangers, but there was no sign of Garrett's silver BMW anywhere in the vicinity. Just as I was beginning to think I had made a terrible mistake, that perhaps he had entered through a different entrance, or parked somewhere else, I saw a familiar figure emerge from the building's main lobby. It was Vivienne Clark, but she looked nothing like the professional secretary I had met at company functions. Gone was the conservative business attire and carefully pinned up hair. Instead, she wore a flowing sundress that showed off her figure, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders in loose waves. She looked like a woman dressed for a romantic afternoon, not someone leaving work on a Saturday. My hands trembling slightly, I fumbled for my phone and managed to take several photos as Vivienne walked to her car, a red convertible parked in the visitors section. She seemed relaxed, even happy, humming to herself as she unlocked her door. Just before getting in, she pulled out her own phone and made a call, laughing at something the person on the other end said. I followed her car at a safe distance, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it over the radio. Vivienne drove through downtown Meridian past the shopping district and the historic courthouse, before turning onto Riverside Boulevard, an upscale area known for its boutique hotels and high-end restaurants. She pulled into the valet station of the Grandview Hotel, a luxurious establishment that Garrett and I had visited once for our 3rd wedding anniversary. I watched from across the street as she handed her keys to the valet and walked into the lobby with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going. 20 minutes later, I saw Garrett's BMW pull up to the same valet station. The sight of my husband stepping out of his car dressed not in the business casual attire he had worn to work that morning, but in an expensive polo shirt and khakis I had never seen before, hit me like a physical blow. He looked younger somehow, more relaxed and animated than he had in our home for months. This was not a man burdened by critical merger proposals or weekend business obligations. This was a man meeting his lover for an afternoon trip. I sat in my car for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, trying to process what I had just witnessed. The evidence was undeniable, yet part of my mind still scrambled for alternative explanations. Maybe this was some kind of business meeting after all. Maybe Vivienne was helping him with a surprise for me. Maybe there was some perfectly innocent reason why my husband was meeting his secretary at a luxury hotel on a Saturday afternoon, while telling me he was working. But deep down I knew the truth. I had known it the moment I heard him call her Viv in that familiar, intimate tone. I had probably known it for months, buried beneath layers of denial and hope and the desperate desire to believe that my marriage was worth fighting for. The realization that followed was even more devastating than discovering the affair itself. This wasn't a recent development. The way Garrett and Vivienne moved, the ease with which they navigated their secret meeting, the practiced nature of their deception, all of it pointed to a relationship that had been going on for quite some time, months, perhaps even longer. As I drove home through the quiet streets of Willowbrook Heights, past the perfectly manicured lawns and white picket fences that had once represented everything I wanted in life, I began to see my recent past with brutal clarity. All those late nights at the office, all those weekend business emergencies, all those times Garrett had been distant and distracted. It wasn't work stress or career ambition that had been pulling him away from me. It was Vivienne, the woman I had politely chatted with at company Christmas parties, who had always been so helpful when I called the office, who had sent me a sympathy card when my mother passed away last year. That same woman had been sleeping with my husband and helping him lie to my face. When I arrived home, our house felt different somehow, as if the very walls had been contaminated by the knowledge of Garrett's betrayal. I walked through the rooms we had decorated together, past the photos of our wedding and honeymoon, the artwork we had chosen as a couple, the furniture we had saved for and purchased with such excitement. Everything felt like a lie now, an elaborate stage set designed to maintain the illusion of a happy marriage while the leading man performed in an entirely different production across town. I found myself in our bedroom, staring at the bed where Garrett and I had made love, shared dreams, comforted each other through difficult times. How many nights had he lain beside me, pretending to sleep while his mind was with another woman? How many mornings had he kissed me goodbye before rushing off to meet his mistress? The humiliation was overwhelming, but what surprised me was the anger that came with it. Not just anger at Garrett's betrayal, but anger at my own blindness, my willingness to accept his explanations and excuses, my eagerness to believe the best of him, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. I had been so busy being the perfect wife, the understanding partner, the supportive spouse, that I had failed to notice my husband had mentally divorced me months ago. While I was maintaining our home, managing our social calendar, and building my own career, Garrett had been building an entirely separate life with another woman. But as I stood in that bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of our shared history, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to confront Garrett with tears and accusations. I wasn't going to beg him to choose me over his mistress. I wasn't going to play the role of the betrayed wife, desperately trying to win back a man who had already given his heart to someone else. Instead, I was going to plan. I was going to prepare. And when the time came, I was going to show Garrett Thornfield exactly what it felt like to lose everything you thought you could take for granted. The weak, trusting woman he had married was about to disappear forever, replaced by someone who understood that in matters of the heart, sometimes the only way to win is to make sure your opponent loses everything. Over the following weeks, I developed a painful education in the patterns of betrayal that had been hiding in plain sight throughout my marriage. What I had initially dismissed as isolated incidents of neglect and disrespect now revealed themselves as part of a systematic campaign of deception that stretched back much further than I had imagined. Armed with my newfound awareness, I began to notice details that would have escaped me before. The way Garrett's eyes lit up when his phone buzzed with certain text messages, how he would angle the screen away from me with practiced subtlety, the expensive cologne he had started wearing, not the one I had given him for our anniversary, but something new and sophisticated that he claimed was a confidence booster for important meetings. The way he had suddenly become concerned with his physical appearance, joining an upscale gym downtown instead of using our home equipment, buying new clothes without consulting me, even whitening his teeth with a procedure that cost nearly $2,000. But it wasn't just the obvious signs that painted the picture of his double life.
It was the way our entire relationship dynamic had been restructured to accommodate his affair, disguised as natural evolution or career demand.
For instance, Garrett had instituted what he called communication boundaries about 6 months earlier. He explained that constantly being interrupted by personal calls and text during work hours was affecting his productivity and professional image. Therefore, he would no longer be available for casual conversations during business hours unless there was a genuine emergency. At the time, this seemed reasonable, even admirable. I respected his dedication to his career and adjusted my expectations accordingly. Now I understood that these boundaries weren't about professional focus. They were about creating uninterrupted time with Vivienne, without the inconvenience of his wife calling to check in. Similarly, Garrett had convinced me that our social life needed to be more strategic for his career advancement. We began attending fewer casual gatherings with our longtime friends from college, people like Amanda Sterling and her husband Jake, who had been part of our inner circle for years. Instead, our social calendar became dominated by Meridian financial events, charity galas, and networking functions, where Garrett could be seen as a successful, sophisticated couple. I had initially been flattered by this elevation in our social status, proud to play the role of the accomplished wife supporting her ambitious husband's career. I spent considerable time and money selecting appropriate outfits for these events, researching the other attendees so I could engage in meaningful conversations, and learning about wine and art, and other topics that would help me fit in with Meridian's elite social circle. What I failed to recognize was that these events served a dual purpose for Garrett. They allowed him to parade me around as proof of his stability and success, the beautiful, accomplished wife who validated his image as a family man, while simultaneously providing him with opportunities to interact publicly with Vivienne in a professional context. At every company function, I watched my husband and his secretary perform an elaborate dance of professional courtesy that masked their intimate relationship. I remembered now how at the last Meridian Christmas party, held at the exclusive Harmony Club downtown, Vivienne had approached us during cocktail hour. She was stunning in a black evening gown that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, her hair styled in an elegant updo that showcased diamond earrings I had never seen before. "Mr. and Miss Thornfield," she had said with perfect professional deference, "I hope you're enjoying the evening. Garrett, Mr. Morrison was looking for you earlier. Something about the Hartwell account." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in hidden communication. To any observer, including me at the time, it appeared to be nothing more than a secretary delivering a work-related message to her boss. But now, analyzing the memory with new eyes, I could see the subtle signals being exchanged. The way Vivienne's fingers briefly touched Garrett's hand as she handed him a business card. The meaningful look they shared when she mentioned that she would be working late the following Tuesday to prepare for a client presentation. The way Garrett's voice softened almost imperceptibly when he thanked her for her dedication and attention to detail. Even more humiliating was the realization that Vivienne had been studying me during these interactions, cataloging my mannerisms and responses, learning how to navigate around the wife who stood unknowingly between her and her lover. She knew exactly how to compliment my dress in a way that seemed genuine, but was actually condescending. She understood precisely how long she could monopolize Garrett's attention before I might become suspicious. She had become an expert in the art of hiding in plain sight. The financial patterns told an even more disturbing story. Over the past year, Garrett had gradually taken control of more aspects of our household finances, claiming it was more efficient for him to handle everything through his accounts, since he had better investment opportunities through his work connection. I had agreed readily, grateful not to have to manage the tedious details of bill paying and investment tracking. Now, going through our credit card statements and bank records with the suspicious eye of a betrayed wife rather than the trusting gaze of a devoted partner, I discovered a trail of expenses that had nothing to do with work or our marriage. There were charges at expensive restaurants during lunch hours when Garrett claimed to be in back-to-back meetings, hotel charges in nearby cities during weekends when he was supposedly attending business conferences, purchases at high-end boutiques and jewelry stores that had never resulted in gifts for me. Most painfully, I found evidence of charges at Bellecourt Spa, an exclusive wellness retreat about an hour outside the city, for couples massage packages and romantic weekend getaways. The dates corresponded with times when Garrett had told me he was attending mandatory training seminars or visiting his elderly aunt in Crestwood Falls. An aunt who I now recalled with sickening clarity had passed away 3 years ago. The psychological manipulation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of his deception. Garrett had systematically undermined my confidence and intuition while positioning himself as the rational, patient partner dealing with an increasingly emotional and demanding wife. Whenever I expressed concerns about his behavior or our relationship, he would respond with a combination of gaslighting and false reassurance that left me questioning my own perception. "You're being paranoid, Delilah," became his standard response to any questions about his whereabouts or behavior. "I understand that you're feeling insecure because work has been so demanding lately, but you need to trust me. Haven't I always taken care of you? Haven't I always been faithful and committed to our marriage?" He would follow these dismissals with just enough affection and attention to keep me off balance. A surprise dinner at our favorite restaurant, a weekend away at a bed and breakfast, a thoughtful gift that showed he had been thinking about me during one of his busy weeks. These gestures were perfectly calibrated to reinforce my guilt for doubting him while providing him with relationship insurance he could reference during future conflicts. "Remember how wonderful our weekend in Rosehaven was last month?" he would say when I complained about feeling disconnected from him. "Remember how I surprised you with that necklace you admired? Does that sound like the behavior of a man who doesn't love his wife?" The most insidious part of his manipulation was how he had convinced me that my professional success was somehow threatening to our marriage. When Brightwater Marketing began experiencing rapid growth thanks to contracts I had secured, Garrett started making subtle comments about how my work schedule was affecting our relationship. He suggested that perhaps I was becoming too focused on my career at the expense of our personal life, that maybe I should consider scaling back my responsibilities to make more time for us as a couple. At the time, I interpreted this as romantic concern, evidence that he missed spending time with me and wanted to prioritize our relationship. I actually felt guilty about my professional achievements, worried that my success was creating distance between us. I began turning down speaking engagements and networking opportunities, delegating more responsibilities to my team so I could be home more often for Garrett. Now I understood that his concern had nothing to do with missing me and everything to do with maintaining control. A financially independent, professionally successful wife was a threat to his ability to manipulate and deceive. By undermining my confidence in my career and encouraging me to become more financially dependent on him, he was ensuring that I would be less likely to leave even if I discovered his infidelity. The pattern was so comprehensive, so carefully constructed, that I found myself almost admiring its diabolic efficiency even as it broke my heart. Garrett had managed to maintain 2 complete relationships simultaneously, giving Vivienne all the passion and attention he withheld from me while using me as a cover story and financial safety net. He got to experience the excitement of a forbidden romance while maintaining the stability and respectability of marriage, and he had convinced me that any problems in our relationship were the result of my own insecurities and unrealistic expectations. But as I sat in our home office, surrounded by evidence of his systematic betrayal, I realized that Garrett had made one crucial mistake in his elaborate deception. He had underestimated the woman he married, assuming that my love for him had made me permanently blind and weak. He was about to learn that betraying someone's trust doesn't just reveal their partner's capacity for deception, it also reveals their own capacity for strategic thinking and calculated revenge. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in late November when the autumn air had turned sharp and the first hints of winter were creeping through the bare branches of our maple tree. I had spent the day putting together a comprehensive presentation for Brightwater's expansion into the Pacific Northwest market, a project that could potentially double our agency's revenue within 2 years. The work was challenging and exciting, the kind of strategic thinking that reminded me why I had fallen in love with marketing in the first place. I was genuinely excited to share the news with Garrett when he came home. Despite everything I had discovered about his double life, part of me still hoped that perhaps we could find our way back to each other, that maybe the passion and partnership we had once shared could be rekindled if I just tried hard enough to reach. Garrett arrived home around 7:30, later than usual but not unusually so. He looked tired and slightly disheveled, His tie loosened and his hair mussed in a way that suggested he had been running his hands through it. There was something different about his demeanor that evening, a distracted energy that seemed to vibrate just beneath his carefully composed surface. "How was your?" I asked as he hung his coat in the hallway closet, the same question I had asked him thousands of times over the course of our marriage. "Fine," he replied without looking at me, his standard response that had long ago replaced the detailed stories and shared laughter that once characterized our evening reunions. "Just the usual corporate nonsense. You know how it is." But I was determined not to let his mood dampen my enthusiasm. "I have some amazing news to share with you," I said, following him into the kitchen where he was already reaching for a beer from the refrigerator. "The partnership I've been working on with the Portland and Seattle agencies came through. We're going to be expanding Brightwater's operations to the entire Pacific Northwest. It's the biggest deal in the company's history." Garrett took a long drink from his beer before responding, and when he did, his tone was flat and uninterested. "That's nice, Delilah. I'm sure it will keep you busy." The dismissal stung, but I pressed on. "Garrett, this is huge. We're talking about potentially tripling my salary over the next 3 years. I'll be managing a team of 40 people across 3 states. This could change everything for us financially." Finally, he looked at me directly, and what I saw in his eyes was not pride or excitement or even mild interest. It was irritation, as if my professional achievement was an inconvenience that he didn't have the energy to pretend to care about. "Look, Delilah," he said, setting his beer down on the granite countertop with more force than necessary. "I've had a really long day dealing with actual important business matters. I don't have the bandwidth right now to get excited about your little marketing project." Little marketing projects. The phrase hit me like a slap across the face. This was a woman who had just secured a multi-million-dollar expansion deal, who had spent months negotiating complex partnerships and building strategic alliances that would transform her company's future. And to my husband, it was a little marketing project that didn't deserve his attention or respect. "This isn't a little project, Garrett," I said, my voice carefully controlled despite the fury building in my chest. "This is a career-defining achievement. I thought you would be proud of me." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. It was the kind of laugh someone makes when they're trying to be patient with a child who doesn't understand how the adult world works. "Proud? Delilah, let's be realistic here. You work for a tiny local agency in a mid-sized market. Your biggest clients are car dealerships and dentist offices. Just because you manage to talk some other small-town agencies into working together doesn't mean you've conquered the business world." The casual cruelty of his words took my breath away. This was the man who had once told me that my ambition and intelligence were among the qualities he loved most about me. The man who had encouraged me to pursue my dreams and build a career that fulfilled me. Now he was speaking to me like I was a delusional amateur playing at business while he handled the real work of the world. But what happened next pushed me beyond anger into a realm of clarity I had never experienced before. My phone, which was sitting on the kitchen island between us, buzzed with an incoming text message. The preview was visible on the lock screen. "Rebecca just saw the Seattle Times article about the expansion. You're famous. Link attached." Garrett glanced at the phone and his expression shifted to something between surprise and annoyance. "What article?" I picked up my phone and opened the message. Rebecca had sent me a link to a business section article titled "Regional Marketing Powerhouse Brightwater Announces Major Pacific Northwest Expansion." The piece featured a photo of me shaking hands with the Seattle agency's founder, along with quotes from industry leaders about the strategic brilliance of the partnership model we had developed. As I read the article aloud, describing how business analysts were calling our expansion strategy innovative and a model for regional growth in the digital age, I watched Garrett's face change. The dismissive irritation was replaced by something that looked almost like panic. "They're calling it one of the most significant business developments in the regional marketing sector this year," I finished, looking up from my phone to meet his eyes. For a moment, Garrett said nothing. Then, instead of apologizing for his earlier dismissal or congratulating me on the recognition, he said something that revealed the true depth of his selfishness and contempt. "Well, I hope all this career success is worth it when you're sitting alone in your office working 60-hour weeks while your marriage falls apart." The accusation was so unfair, so completely divorced from reality, that I actually laughed out loud. Here was a man who had been systematically cheating on me for months, who spent his evenings and weekends with his mistress while telling me he was working,
who had shown no interest in my thoughts, feelings, or achievements for the better part of a year, and he had the audacity to suggest that my career success was somehow threatening our marriage. My career success is threatening our marriage, I repeated, my voice rising for the first time in the conversation. Garrett, when was the last time you asked me about my work? When was the last time you showed any interest in my life beyond whether dinner was ready when you got home? That's different, he said, his jaw tightening in the way it did when he felt cornered. I show interest in the things that matter. I don't need to get excited about every little milestone in your hobby career. Hobby career, that was the final straw. Hobby career. I set my phone down carefully, my hands trembling with the effort to maintain control. Garrett, this hobby career has contributed nearly 40% of our household income for the past 3 years. This hobby career just secured a deal that will likely make me the highest earning partner in one of the fastest growing marketing firms in the Pacific Northwest. And you're standing there acting like I should be grateful for your permission to pursue my little projects while you pat me on the head and tell me what really matters in the world. But Garrett wasn't backing down. If anything, my anger seemed to trigger something defensive and mean-spirited in him that I had never seen before. You want to know what really matters? What really matters is that I've been carrying this family financially, while you play office with your friends at that cute little agency. What really matters is that I've been building real wealth through real business relationships while you celebrate contracts with car dealerships like you've conquered Wall Street. What really matters is that I work with serious people who make serious money, not playing house with a bunch of small-town entrepreneurs who think they're the next big thing. Each word was carefully chosen to wound, designed to make me feel small and foolish and grateful for whatever scraps of attention he was willing to throw my way. But instead of shrinking under his attack, I felt something cold and hard crystallize in my chest. You're right, Garrett, I said quietly, my voice steady and calm in a way that clearly surprised him. Let's talk about what really matters. Let's talk about the serious people you work with. Let's talk about your secretary Vivienne, for instance. I'm sure she's very serious about her work, very dedicated, very attentive to your needs. The change in Garrett's expression was immediate and unmistakable. The color drained from his face and his eyes widened with a fear that confirmed everything I had suspected and more. I don't know what you're implying, he said, but his voice had lost all its confident authority. I'm not implying anything, I replied, stepping closer to him, until we were standing only inches apart. I'm stating facts. I know about the Grandview Hotel, I know about the spa weekend, I know about the jewelry purchases and the romantic dinners, and every other lie you've told me while carrying on your affair with your secretary. Garrett opened his mouth to speak, probably to deny or deflect or gaslight me into questioning what I had seen with my own eyes, but I held up my hand to stop him. Don't, I said, my voice carrying a strength I didn't know I possessed. Don't insult my intelligence any further by lying to my face. I know everything, Garrett. The only question now is what we're going to do about it. The silence that followed my revelation stretched between us like a chasm, filled with 8 years of shared history that had just been revealed as an elaborate fiction. Garrett's face cycled through a series of expressions: shock, fear, calculation, and finally, a cold hardness that I had never seen before but somehow recognized as his truest self. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Gone was the dismissive condescension and fake concern. What remained was something calculating and cruel, the voice of a man who had been caught and was now prepared to fight dirty to maintain his position. So what if I am, he said, straightening his shoulders and meeting my eyes with a defiance that took my breath away. What exactly are you going to do about it, Delilah? File for divorce? Take half of everything and run back to your little marketing job? You think you can make it on your own out there? The casual admission of his betrayal, delivered without a hint of remorse or shame, was somehow more devastating than months of lies and deception. Here was my husband of 8 years, the man who had promised to love and cherish me, treating his infidelity like a minor inconvenience that I was overreacting to. I could have that conversation with you, he continued, leaning against the kitchen counter with an air of superiority that made my skin crawl, but let's be honest about what you'd be walking away from. This house, this lifestyle, the financial security you've gotten comfortable with, all of that goes away if you decide to make a big deal out of this. He gestured around our kitchen with its custom cabinets and granite countertops, as if the material possessions we had accumulated together were the only things that mattered in our relationship. You think your precious career expansion is going to replace what you have here. You think managing marketing campaigns is going to pay for the kind of life you've been living as my wife, because I can guarantee you that it won't. You'll be starting over at 32, trying to build a life on a fraction of what we have together. The threat was clear and calculated. Garrett was betting that my fear of financial insecurity and social embarrassment would override my anger at his betrayal. He was counting on the same dependency he had been systematically cultivating throughout our marriage to keep me trapped in a relationship that had become nothing more than a convenient facade for his double life. But, as I listened to him lay out his case for why I should accept his infidelity as the price of maintaining my comfortable lifestyle, something fundamental shifted inside me. The woman who had spent months making excuses for his behavior, who had questioned her own instincts and blamed herself for the distance in our marriage, was gone. In her place stood someone I barely recognized, someone cold and strategic and utterly unafraid of the consequences of telling the truth. "You're absolutely right, Garrett," I said, my voice so calm it surprised even me. "I should think very carefully about what I'd be walking away from. So, let me be clear about what that is." I moved to the kitchen island and leaned against it, mirroring his casual posture while keeping my eyes locked on his face. "I'd be walking away from a husband who spends his weekends in hotels with his secretary while telling me he's working. I'd be walking away from a man who dismisses my professional achievements as hobby projects, while using my income to subsidize his affair. I'd be walking away from someone who thinks so little of me that he believes I'll accept being cheated on as long as the mortgage gets paid." Garrett's confident expression flickered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered. "You're being dramatic, Delilah. People have problems in their marriages, they work through them, they don't blow up their entire lives over temporary situations." Temporary. I laughed, and the sound was harsh even to my own ears. "Is that what you call a year-long affair with your secretary? A temporary situation?" His face went pale at my specificity, confirming what I had suspected about the timeline of his betrayal. "How long exactly were you planning to work through this temporary situation?" I continued. "Were you going to keep both relationships going indefinitely? Were you planning to divorce me eventually and marry Vivienne? Or were you just going to keep things exactly as they are, with me playing the dutiful wife while you get all the excitement and passion from someone else?" For the first time since our conversation began, Garrett looked genuinely uncomfortable. The question of his long-term intentions had clearly forced him to confront the reality that his current arrangement was unsustainable, that eventually he would have to make choices he had been avoiding. "It's complicated," he said finally, running his hand through his hair in a gesture I had once found endearing but now recognized as a tell that revealed his discomfort. "No, Garrett, it's really not complicated at all. You wanted to have your cake and eat it too. You wanted the stability and respectability of marriage along with the excitement of an affair. You wanted a wife to manage your home and your social obligations, while you played house with your mistress. What's complicated is how you convinced yourself that this was sustainable, or that I was too stupid to eventually figure it out." The accusation hit its mark. Garrett's composure cracked and his voice rose for the first time in our conversation. "Don't act like you're some innocent victim here, Delilah. You checked out of this marriage long before I did. You've been so focused on your career and your goals that you haven't paid attention to what I needed. When was the last time you initiated intimacy? When was the last time you showed any interest in my work or my concerns? You turned me into a roommate and then act surprised when I found someone who actually wants to be with me." The blame shifting was so predictable, so textbook that I almost smiled. Here was the man who had been systematically lying to me for over a year, trying to convince me that his infidelity was somehow my fault for not being attentive enough to his needs. "So let me understand this correctly," I said, my voice dripping with mock sincerity. "I focused too much on building a successful career that has contributed significantly to our household income, and that somehow justified you starting a secret relationship with another woman. I didn't initiate sex often enough, so obviously the reasonable response was for you to find someone who would, rather than say talking to your wife about your concerns." "That's not what I'm saying." "That's exactly what you're saying, Garrett. You're saying that instead of communicating with me about problems in our marriage, instead of suggesting counseling or having honest conversations about what we both needed, you decided to handle your dissatisfaction by starting an affair, and then lying to my face about it for months. I pushed away from the kitchen island and took a step toward him, feeling more powerful than I had in years. But here's what you're missing in your little justification speech. Even if everything you said about our marriage was true, even if I had been the worst wife in the world, that still wouldn't justify what you've done. It would justify asking for a divorce. It would justify marriage counseling. It would justify an honest conversation about whether we wanted to work on our relationship or end it. It wouldn't justify lying, cheating, and manipulating me while you conducted a year-long affair. Garrett's jaw tightened and I saw a flash of something dangerous in his eye. Fine, he said, his voice dropping to a low, threatening tone. You want honesty? Here's honesty. Yes, I've been seeing Vivienne. Yes, it's been going on for over a year. And yes, I've been happier in the last 12 months than I have been in the previous 3 years of our marriage combined. She appreciates me. She makes me feel like a man worth being with. She doesn't treat every conversation like a business meeting, or act like my success is somehow threatening to her independence. Each word was designed to wound, to make me feel inadequate and unwanted, and responsible for driving him into another woman's arms. So if you want to file for divorce and start over with your little marketing empire, go ahead, but don't expect me to make it easy for you. Don't expect me to just hand over half of everything I've worked for because you can't handle the reality that marriages require compromise and sacrifice. And don't expect me to feel guilty about finding happiness with someone who actually wants to make me happy. The speech was clearly something he had been rehearsing, probably for months in preparation for this exact moment. It was a carefully crafted blend of admission, justification, and threat, designed to leave me feeling simultaneously guilty for driving him away, and terrified of the consequences of leaving him. But instead of the emotional devastation he was clearly expecting, I felt something else entirely, a crystal clear sense of purpose and an almost overwhelming relief that the pretense was finally over. Thank you, I said quietly, and the unexpected response clearly caught him off guard. Thank you.
Thank you for finally being honest about who you really are. I clarified. Thank you for showing me that the man I thought I married never actually existed. Thank you for making what I have to do next so much easier. Something in my tone made Garrett take a step back, his confident posture wavering for the first time since our conversation began. What you have to do next? I smiled at him then. And it wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of someone who had just realized that she held all the cards in a game her opponent didn't even know they were playing. I'm not going to file for divorce, Garrett, I said, watching confusion replace the calculation in his eyes. I'm not going to fight you for half of our assets or make demands about alimony or property division. I'm not going to make any of this complicated or difficult or expensive. Relief flickered across his face, and I almost felt sorry for how wrong he was about what was coming next. Instead, I continued, I'm going to make this very simple for both of us. Tomorrow morning, you're going to wake up and discover that your wife has disappeared. Not literally, of course, but the woman who has been managing your household, maintaining your social calendar, and providing you with the perfect cover story for your affair, will be gone. In her place, you'll find someone who is no longer interested in making your life comfortable or convenient or easy. The confusion on Garrett's face was shifting to something that looked almost like fear. What does that mean? It means that starting tonight, you get to figure out how to manage your double life without my unknowing assistance. It means that when Vivienne asks you why you can't stay the night, you'll have to come up with explanations that don't involve your devoted wife waiting at home. It means that when you need someone to accompany you to company functions, you'll have to decide whether you want to bring your wife or your mistress. Because I won't be playing the role of the clueless spouse anymore. I paused, letting the implications sink in. Most importantly, it means that you no longer get to have the best of both worlds. You wanted honesty, here's mine. You're about to find out exactly how much your comfortable life depended on having a wife who didn't know she was being played for a fool. And I'm very curious to see how long your affair survives, when it's no longer a thrilling secret, but a complicated reality that requires actual sacrifice and commitment. The transformation began immediately, and I could see that Garrett had no idea what to do with a wife who was no longer playing by the rules he had established for our marriage. That night, after our confrontation in the kitchen, he seemed to expect that we would somehow return to our normal routine. That despite everything that had been said, I would still sleep in our bed, still wake up and make coffee, still maintain the domestic infrastructure that had been invisibly supporting his double life. Instead, I gathered my pillow and a blanket and made myself comfortable in the guest bedroom, locking the door behind me. When Garrett knocked an hour later, his voice carried a note of uncertainty that I had never heard before. "Delilah, come on. Don't be childish about this. We can work through this like adults." I didn't respond. Let him stand outside that door and contemplate what it meant to have a wife who was no longer interested in making things easy for him. The next morning, I woke up early and went through my usual routine with one significant difference. I prepared breakfast for exactly one person. When Garrett emerged from our bedroom, clearly hoping that a night's sleep had restored our normal dynamic, he found me sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a bowl of oatmeal, reading the news on my tablet. "Where's my breakfast?" he asked, the question revealing just how accustomed he had become to being taken care of without having to ask. "I assume it's wherever you usually get breakfast when you're not here," I replied without looking up from my screen. "The refrigerator has eggs and bread if you'd like to make something for yourself." The simple act of not automatically catering to his needs seemed to genuinely confuse him. For 8 years I had been getting up early to ensure he had a proper breakfast before leaving for work, packing his lunch when he had important meetings, making sure his clothes were clean and pressed, and ready for whatever the day required. The absence of that invisible labor was apparently more jarring than he had anticipated. "Delilah, this is ridiculous. You can't just stop." "Stop what?" I interrupted, finally looking up at him. "Stop being your unpaid personal assistant. Stop managing your life so efficiently that you forget you're supposed to be a functioning adult." "You're absolutely right. I can't stop something I'm no longer doing." I watched him struggle with the reality that making his own breakfast was going to make him late for work, that he would have to figure out his own lunch arrangements, that the smooth operation of his daily routine had depended entirely on my uncompensated labor. The real power shift began when I implemented the most strategic part of my plan. I stopped providing him with cover for his affair. That evening, when Garrett's phone rang during dinner, takeout I had ordered for myself and didn't offer to share, I watched him look at the caller ID with the expression of a man caught between two competing demands. "Aren't you going to answer that?" I asked pleasantly. "It might be important." For months, Garrett had been able to take calls from Vivienne in my presence because I had trusted that they were work-related. He could step out to accept her calls because I assumed he was being considerate about not disturbing our time together with business matters. He could text with her freely because I believed I was seeing professional communication between colleagues. Now, with my eyes on him and my intentions clear, he had to make a choice: answer the call and reveal the personal nature of his relationship with his secretary, or ignore it and leave his mistress wondering why he was suddenly unavailable. He let the call go to voicemail. "That was unlike you," I observed. "Usually you take all your work calls, no matter what time it is." "I hope it wasn't anything urgent." The discomfort on his face was delicious. For the first time in our marriage, Garrett was experiencing the constraints that most cheating spouses have to navigate. The challenge of maintaining two relationships when both parties expect access and attention. Over the following days, I implemented what I privately called my strategic withdrawal from the systems that had been enabling his affair. I stopped managing our social calendar, which meant that when his colleague Daniel Morrison called to invite us to a dinner party at his home in Willowbrook Estates, I handed the phone directly to Garrett. "Daniel wants to know if we can make it to his dinner party this Saturday," I said loudly enough that Daniel could hear me through the phone. "I told him you'd have to check your schedule and get back to him, since I never know what your weekend plans are anymore." I watched Garrett's face as he realized that he now had to navigate the conflict between his social obligations as a married man and his romantic plans with his mistress. For months, I had been unknowingly helping him manage this exact problem by accepting his excuses about weekend work commitments and rescheduling our social plans accordingly. Without my cooperation, he was going to have to start making visible choices between his two lives. He accepted the dinner invitation, which meant that Saturday evening, for the first time in months, Vivienne was going to have to entertain herself while her lover attended a social function with his wife. But I wasn't done. During the week leading up to the Morrison dinner party,
I made a point of being exceptionally social and visible. I called our friend Amanda Sterling and suggested lunch, making sure to mention how excited I was about the recent expansion of my company and how much I was looking forward to the new challenges ahead. I accepted an invitation to speak at a local businesswomen's networking event, knowing that news of my professional success would spread throughout our social circle. Most importantly, I began reaching out to people we hadn't seen in months, friends from college and early in our marriage, who had gradually been phased out as Garrett redirected our social life toward his professional network. I invited Rachel and Michael Chen to join us for dinner, reconnected with my former colleague Sarah Brennan, and even reached out to Garrett's own college roommate, Austin Rivers, whom we hadn't seen since our wedding despite the fact that he lived only an hour away. Each of these social connections represented a potential witness to our marriage, people who would notice changes in our dynamic and potentially ask uncomfortable questions. For a man trying to maintain a secret affair, visibility and social scrutiny were the last things he wanted. The dinner party at the Morrisons became a perfect example of how my new approach was disrupting Garrett's carefully managed double life. Throughout the evening, I was charming, engaged, and visibly successful. I spoke passionately about my work, laughed genuinely at other people's stories, and made plans for future social gatherings with enthusiasm I hadn't felt in months. Meanwhile, Garrett seemed tense and distracted, checking his phone more frequently than usual and seeming genuinely uncomfortable with the attention my professional achievements were receiving from the other guests. When Daniel Morrison raised a toast to my recent business expansion, calling it an inspiration to all of us who dream of building something significant, I watched Garrett struggle to maintain an appropriate expression of spousal pride while clearly wishing he were anywhere else. But the real test came when Linda Morrison, Daniel's wife, pulled me aside near the end of the evening for what seemed like a casual conversation about work-life balance. "I have to ask," Linda said, refilling our wine glasses as we stood on the Morrisons' back patio, "how do you and Garrett manage two such demanding careers? Daniel struggles to balance his work commitments with family time, and he's not dealing with the kind of expansion you're managing." It was the perfect opening to play the role of the satisfied wife, to deflect attention from any problems in our marriage, and maintain the facade that had been protecting Garrett's affair. 6 months ago, I would have given Linda a diplomatic answer about communication and mutual support, reinforcing the image of our marriage as a partnership of equals. Instead, I smiled and said, "Honestly, Linda, it's been challenging. Garrett's work has been requiring so much of his time lately, weekends, evenings, overnight trips for client meetings. Sometimes I feel like I'm managing my career expansion as a single woman, because he's rarely available to discuss major decisions or even celebrate success." The comment was perfectly calibrated, not accusatory enough to seem like I was complaining about my husband, but specific enough to plant seeds of curiosity about what exactly was keeping Garrett so busy outside of normal business hours. Linda's expression shifted slightly, her social radar clearly picking up on the subtext of my response. "That does sound difficult," she said carefully. "Daniel mentioned that Meridian Financial has been growing rapidly. I suppose that means longer hours for everyone." "I'm sure that's part of it," I replied with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "Though I have to admit, I sometimes wonder if all those weekend work sessions are really as necessary as they seem. But then again, I'm just a marketing person. What do I know about high finance?" It was a masterful piece of social engineering. I had managed to express doubt about Garrett's stated whereabouts, while appearing to defer to his superior knowledge of his own industry. Linda would almost certainly share this conversation with her husband, who would then pay closer attention to the discrepancies between Garrett's claimed work schedule and the actual demands of his position at Meridian Financial. Throughout this exchange, I could see Garrett watching us from across the patio, clearly uncomfortable with the length and intensity of our conversation. When we rejoined the larger group, his relief was palpable, but I noticed that he was more careful about his phone usage for the rest of the evening. The drive home was tense and largely silent. I could tell that Garrett wanted to ask what Linda and I had discussed, but he also seemed afraid of what he might learn. Finally, as we pulled into our driveway, he couldn't contain his curiosity any longer. "You and Linda seem to have a lot to talk about tonight," he said, his tone carefully casual. "Oh, you know how it is with Linda," I replied breezily. She always wants to know everyone's business. Tonight she was particularly curious about how we manage our careers and marriage with both of us being so busy. I told her how demanding your work has been lately, all those weekend meetings and evening commitments. She seemed impressed by your dedication. I could see the wheels turning in Garrett's head as he tried to assess whether my conversation with Linda posed any threat to his carefully constructed lies. The beauty of my strategy was that I hadn't actually said anything untrue or inappropriate. I had simply stopped actively protecting him from the natural consequences of his deception. What exactly did you tell her? He asked as we walked toward our front door. Just the truth, I said, inserting my key into the lock. That you're rarely available anymore because work requires so much of your time, that I sometimes feel like I'm managing my career as a single woman, because you're always busy with client commitments. You know, the reality of our marriage. Garrett was quiet as we entered the house, but I could tell that my words had hit their mark. For the first time since beginning his affair, he was being forced to confront the fact that his lies were creating a public narrative about our marriage that wouldn't withstand close scrutiny. If people started paying attention to the discrepancies between his claimed work schedule and his actual professional responsibilities, questions would inevitably arise about where he was really spending his time. As I prepared for bed in the guest room that had become my sanctuary, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with reclaiming my agency. For months I had been unknowingly complicit in my own betrayal, providing Garrett with the perfect cover story for his affair. Now, he was going to have to figure out how to maintain his double life without my inadvertent assist. The woman who had spent 8 years making his life comfortable and convenient was gone. In her place was someone who understood that the most powerful thing she could do was simply stop making things easy for a man who had taken her support for granted while systematically betraying her trust. The public exposure I had been orchestrating reached its crescendo the following week, when I implemented the most devastating phase of my strategic withdrawal. I stopped hiding the evidence of Garrett's infidelity and began allowing other people to discover it naturally. It started with something as simple as leaving his phone visible when it buzzed with messages from Vivienne. For months, Garrett had been careful to keep his personal communications private, always angling his phone away from me or stepping into another room to read and respond to text. But now that I was no longer playing the role of the trusting wife, I made a point of being present and observant when his phone received attention. The opportunity came on Thursday evening when Garrett was in the shower and his phone, charging on his nightstand, began buzzing repeatedly with incoming messages. In the past I would have either ignored it completely, or perhaps called out to let him know someone was trying to reach him. Instead, I walked over and glanced at the lock screen, which displayed preview text that read, "Can't wait for tomorrow night. I've missed you so much this week. The room at Grandview is confirmed for 8." Rather than confronting him directly, I took photos of the messages with my own phone, creating documentation that would be useful later. But more importantly, I began setting up situations where other people might witness similar revelations. The first opportunity came when our friends Rachel and Michael Chen came over for the dinner I had arranged the previous week. Rachel had been my closest friend since college, someone who knew me well enough to notice changes in my behavior and perceptive enough to pick up on subtle relationship dynamics. I had been looking forward to this evening as a chance to begin rebuilding connections that had been neglected during the isolating months of Garrett's affair. About an hour into the evening, as we were enjoying wine and appetizers in our living room, Garrett's phone buzzed on the coffee table. The message preview was visible to anyone sitting nearby. "Vivienne, thinking about you, wish you were here instead of." Rachel's eyes happened to be on the coffee table when the message appeared, and I watched her expression change as she processed what she had just read. The confusion on her face was immediately followed by a glance at me, clearly trying to gauge whether I had seen the message and how I was reacting to it. I continued my conversation with Michael about his new position at the environmental consulting firm where he worked, acting as though I hadn't noticed anything unusual. But I could see Rachel's mind working, trying to reconcile the intimate tone of the message with her understanding of professional communication between colleagues. When Garrett returned from the kitchen where he had been opening another bottle of wine, he picked up his phone with the casual confidence of someone who assumed he was among people who wouldn't question his communication. But I watched him notice Rachel's expression, saw the moment when he realized that his phone had been receiving messages while he was out of the room. Work emergency? Rachel asked with false casualness, the kind of question that seemed innocent but was clearly probing for more information. Oh, you know how it is, Garrett replied, quickly putting his phone face down on the table. Client situations don't respect dinner party schedules, but the damage was done. Rachel had seen enough to know that whatever message had appeared on Garrett's phone wasn't related to client situations, and her journalist instincts were clearly activated. Throughout the rest of the evening, I noticed her paying closer attention to the interactions between Garrett and me, cataloging the subtle signs of tension and distance that I was no longer trying to hide. The evening became even more revealing when Garrett excused himself to take a phone call around 9 o'clock, claiming it was his colleague from the Morrison account who needed immediate consultation on a time-sensitive matter. He stepped out onto our back patio to take the call, and through the glass doors we could see him pacing and gesturing in the animated way that suggested a personal rather than professional conversation. "That's quite a dedicated colleague," Michael observed, glancing toward the patio where Garrett was laughing at something the caller had said. "Working this late on personal consultation, Vivienne is very dedicated," I replied, taking a sip of my wine. "She's been putting in a lot of extra hours lately to help Garrett with his projects." The casual way I dropped Vivienne's name into the conversation had the intended effect. Rachel's eyebrows rose slightly, and I could see her connecting the dots between the intimate message she had seen earlier and the late-night phone call with the same person. "Vivienne is his secretary, right?" Rachel asked, her tone carefully neutral. "His administrative assistant," I corrected. "Though really, she does so much more than typical administrative work. Garrett says she's become absolutely indispensable to him. They work very closely together on all his important projects." Every word I spoke was technically true, but the context and emphasis created an entirely different impression than the one I would have given 6 months earlier. Then, I would have been defending the professional nature of their relationship, reassuring friends that there was nothing inappropriate about my husband's close working relationship with his attractive assistant. Now, I was allowing people to draw their own conclusions about the nature of that closeness. When Garrett returned from his phone call, his mood was noticeably improved, the kind of relaxed happiness that comes from intimate conversation with someone who makes you feel valued and desired. The contrast with his earlier tension was stark enough that even Michael, who was generally oblivious to relationship dynamics, seemed to notice the change. "Good news on the Morrison account?" Michael asked. "Oh, yes. We managed to sort out the complications," Garrett replied, but his answer was vague and distracted, clearly not focused on maintaining the fiction of work-related communication. The evening continued with increasing awkwardness as Garrett seemed unable to fully concentrate on our guests, repeatedly checking his phone and appearing lost in thoughts that had nothing to do with our dinner party. Meanwhile, I was the picture of gracious hostess, ensuring everyone's glasses stayed full and maintaining engaging conversation about topics ranging from Rachel's recent investigative pieces to Michael's environmental consulting project. The contrast was impossible to miss. While I was fully present and engaged with our friends, my husband seemed to be mentally somewhere else entirely, going through the motions of social politeness, while his attention remained focused on whatever personal drama was unfolding through his phone. But the real moment of exposure came as Rachel and Michael were preparing to leave. Garrett had stepped away to use the bathroom, and Rachel seized the opportunity to have a private word with me. "Delilah," she said quietly, "is everything okay? I don't want to pry, but something's off tonight." It was the opening I had been hoping for, the chance to begin sharing my reality with someone who cared about me, and could provide both emotional support and social witness to what was happening in my marriage. "I'm glad you asked," I said, keeping my voice low but allowing some of the strain I had been hiding to show in my expression. "Things have been difficult lately. Garrett's work has been requiring more and more of his time, and I'm starting to wonder if everything he tells me about his schedule is entirely accurate." Rachel's expression shifted to one of concern and understanding. As an investigative journalist, she was trained to recognize when someone was trying to tell her something important without stating it directly. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. "Months," I replied. "Maybe longer. I keep telling myself that I'm being paranoid, that I should trust my husband and support his career advancement, but tonight, when you saw that message on his phone, I let the sentence trail off. allowing Rachel to fill in the implication. That wasn't a work message, Rachel said quietly, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had seen enough evidence to reach an obvious conclusion. No, I agreed, it wasn't. We were interrupted by Garrett's return from the bathroom, and the conversation shifted back to casual farewells and plans for future gatherings. But as Rachel hugged me goodbye, she whispered in my ear, "Call me tomorrow, we need to talk." After our friends left, Garrett seemed energized in a way that suggested he was planning to go out again, despite the fact that it was nearly 11 o'clock on a Thursday night. "I'm going to head back to the office for a few hours," he announced, already reaching for his car key. "There are some documents I need to review for tomorrow's client meeting." In the past, I would have accepted this explanation without question, perhaps even expressing concern about him working so late and offering to wait up for him. Instead, I simply nodded and said, "Drive safely. I'll be asleep when you get back, so I'll see you tomorrow." The ease with which I accepted his obvious lie seemed to surprise him. For a moment he hesitated, as if he had been expecting resistance, or questions that would require more elaborate explanation. "You're not going to ask when I'll be home," he said, clearly confused by my lack of concern. "Why would I?" I replied with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "You're a grown man who can manage his own schedule. I'm sure you'll come home when you're finished with whatever you need to do." The response clearly unsettled him more than any accusation or demand for details would have. He was discovering that having a wife who didn't care about his whereabouts was actually more disturbing than having one who monitored his movements too closely. After he left, I sent a text message to Rachel. "Thank you for tonight, for asking the questions I haven't been brave enough to ask myself. Can we meet for lunch tomorrow?" Her response came within minutes. "Absolutely." "And Delilah, whatever you're going through, you don't have to go through it alone." As I prepared for bed in my sanctuary guest room, I felt a sense of momentum building. The careful foundation I had been laying over the past weeks was beginning to pay dividends. Garrett's affair was no longer a secret that only I knew about. It was becoming visible to the people who mattered in our social circle, creating a network of witnesses who could validate my experience and support my decision. More importantly, I was no longer isolated in my knowledge of his betrayal. Rachel's sharp journalist instincts and genuine concern for my welfare meant that I now had an ally who understood the situation and could help me navigate the challenges ahead. The woman who had spent months questioning her own perceptions and making excuses for her husband's behavior was being replaced by someone who understood that truth has a way of revealing itself when you stop working so hard to hide it.
Garrett wanted to maintain his double life while keeping me in the dark about his true priorities. But he was about to discover that it's much harder to deceive people when your wife stops helping you manage the deception. The lunch with Rachel the following day marked the beginning of what I came to think of as my independence campaign. The systematic process of rebuilding my life and identity separate from the fiction of my marriage to Garrett. We met at Sanctuary Bistro, a quiet restaurant in the historic district of downtown Meridian, where we could talk freely without worrying about running into anyone from Garrett's professional or social circle. Rachel arrived with the focused energy of someone who had spent the night thinking about our conversation and was ready to help me navigate whatever crisis was unfolding. As an investigative journalist, she had developed an instinct for reading between the lines of what people told her, and I could see that she had already drawn her own conclusions about what was happening in my marriage. "Before we talk about anything else," she said after we had ordered our meals, "I want you to know that Michael and I noticed things last night that went beyond just that text message. The way Garrett interacted with you, the way he seemed emotionally absent even when he was physically present. We've both been concerned about your marriage for a while." The validation was both painful and liberating. Part of me had been hoping that my growing awareness of problems in my marriage was just paranoia, that outside observers wouldn't notice the distance and dysfunction that had become my daily reality. But having friends confirm that the deterioration was visible to others meant that I wasn't imagining the changes in Garrett's behavior. "How long have you been worried?" I asked. "Honestly, since your birthday party last year. Do you remember how distracted Garrett seemed that night? He kept checking his phone. He left early claiming he had to prepare for an important meeting the next day, and he barely participated in any of the conversations about your career achievement. At the time, Michael and I thought maybe he was just going through a stressful period at work, but looking back, she trailed off, but I understood what she wasn't saying. The signs of his affair had been visible to perceptive friends, long before I had been willing to acknowledge them myself. I need to tell you something, I said, deciding that it was time to stop protecting Garrett's reputation and start protecting myself. I know about the affair. I've known for weeks. The woman he's seeing is his secretary, Vivienne Clark, and it's been going on for over a year. Rachel's expression shifted from concern to anger on my behalf, the kind of righteous indignation that comes from watching someone you care about being systematically betrayed. Oh, Delilah, I'm so sorry. What are you going to do? I'm not entirely sure yet, I admitted. But I know what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to beg him to choose me over her. I'm not going to try to compete with his mistress for his attention. And I'm definitely not going to pretend that our marriage can be saved when he's shown me exactly how little he values our relationship. I took a sip of my water and continued, feeling stronger with each word I spoke. What I am going to do is build a life that doesn't depend on him for anything: financial security, social status, emotional fulfillment, or basic respect. I've already started. Actually, I want to tell you about some changes I'm making at work. Over the next hour, I shared with Rachel the details of my career expansion that Garrett had dismissed so cruelly just days earlier. I told her about the Pacific Northwest Partnership, the potential for tripling my income over the next 3 years, and the offer I had received that morning from the Seattle agency to relocate and become their director of strategic development. They want me to move to Seattle, Rachel asked, her eyes widening with excitement. Delilah, that's incredible. What an opportunity. It is, I agreed. The position would put me in charge of developing new markets throughout the Pacific Northwest and potentially into Canada. The salary alone would be more than Garrett and I make combined in our current positions. But more than that, it would be a completely fresh start in a city where nobody knows me as Garrett Thornfield's wife. The idea of starting over in Seattle had been growing more appealing since the job offer arrived in my email that morning. The position represented everything I had been working toward professionally: leadership, creative control, financial independence, and the chance to build something significant from the ground up. But it also represented something equally important: the opportunity to discover who I was, when I wasn't defined by my relationship to someone else. When do they need an answer? Rachel asked. They've given me 2 weeks to consider the offer and negotiate terms. They're also offering to help with relocation expenses and finding housing, which suggests they're serious about wanting me for this position. Rachel leaned back in her chair, studying my face with the intensity she usually reserved for interviews with reluctant sources. You're going to take it, aren't you? I think I am, I said, the words feeling both terrifying and exhilarating as I spoke them out loud for the first time. I've spent the last 8 years building a life around someone else's dreams and priorities. Maybe it's time to find out what my life looks like when I'm the one making the decisions. But even as I talked about Seattle and new beginnings, I knew there were practical matters that needed to be addressed before I could make such a dramatic change. That afternoon, I called my attorney, Patricia Caldwell, whom I had worked with when setting up the legal structure for some of Brightwater's client contracts. Patricia was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s who specialized in family law and business litigation. When I explained that I needed to discuss the legal implications of a potential divorce, she immediately cleared time in her schedule for a consultation that week. I want to understand exactly what I'm entitled to, I told her during our meeting in her downtown office. But more importantly, I want to understand what I need to do to protect myself financially and legally if my marriage ends. Patricia walked me through the basics of divorce law in our state, explaining how assets would likely be divided and what factors courts considered when determining alimony and property distribution. The news was better than I had expected in some ways, and more complicated in others. The good news is that your career achievements and earning potential work in your favor, she explained. Courts are increasingly recognizing that professional women don't need indefinite spousal support, especially when they have the ability to support themselves. The challenging part is that assets acquired during marriage are generally considered marital property, regardless of who earned the money to purchase them. We spent an hour going through the details of my financial situation, from our joint bank accounts and investment portfolios, to the house on Maplewood Drive and even smaller assets like our cars and furniture. Patricia also explained the importance of documenting Garrett's affair, not necessarily for moral reasons, but because infidelity could be relevant to asset division in certain circumstances. "Do you have evidence of the relationship?" she asked. I showed her the photographs I had taken of the text messages on Garrett's phone, along with documentation of the suspicious financial transactions I had discovered. Patricia nodded approvingly as she reviewed the materials. "This is good," she said. "It establishes a clear pattern of deception and shows that marital assets may have been used to support the affair. That could be relevant if we need to argue for a larger share of the assets, based on his misuse of joint funds." But the most important part of our conversation came when Patricia asked about my immediate goals and timeline. "Are you looking to file for divorce immediately? Or are you still considering whether the marriage can be saved?" "The marriage is over," I said without hesitation. "I'm not interested in counseling or reconciliation or any attempt to work through this. What I want is to end this as cleanly and quickly as possible while protecting my financial interests and ensuring that I can move forward with my career plan." Patricia smiled, the expression of someone who appreciated working with clients who had clear objectives and realistic expectations. "In that case, I'd recommend starting the documentation process immediately, even if you're not ready to file papers yet. The more evidence we gather about his affair and the financial impact on your marriage, the stronger position we'll be in when it comes time to negotiate a settlement." That evening, I returned home with a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in months. While Garrett was presumably spending another evening with Vivienne, he had sent a perfunctory text about working late on the Morrison account. I began the process of quietly organizing my financial documents and personal belongings. I opened a separate bank account at a different institution, using my maiden name of Rosewood as a secondary account holder designation. I gathered important documents like my birth certificate, passport, and social security card, storing them in a safety deposit box that only I could access. I made copies of tax returns, investment statements, and insurance policies, creating a complete picture of our marital assets that I could provide to Patricia when needed. Most importantly, I began the psychological process of separating my identity from my role as Garrett's wife. I updated my LinkedIn profile to emphasize my individual achievements and career trajectory. I reached out to professional contacts I hadn't spoken with in months, rebuilding the network that had been somewhat neglected as I focused on maintaining my marriage. I even contacted the realtor who had helped us buy our house on Maplewood Drive, casually inquiring about the current market value of our property. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that I had unknowingly surrendered over the years. The woman who had been diminished by months of gaslighting and emotional neglect was being replaced by someone who understood her own worth and wasn't afraid to demand the respect she deserved. When Garrett finally returned home around midnight, he found me in the living room reading a book about women entrepreneurs who had successfully launched international businesses after major life transition. I looked up briefly when he entered, offered a polite good evening, and returned to my reading without asking about his day or expressing any interest in his obvious lies about working late. The interaction lasted less than 30 seconds, but I could see that my indifference was more unsettling to him than any accusation or emotional confrontation would have. For the first time in our marriage, Garrett was experiencing what it felt like to be married to someone who simply didn't care about his presence or absence, his explanations or his needs. As I listened to him moving around upstairs, probably wondering why his wife was acting like a polite stranger rather than a devoted partner, I smiled to myself. He had no idea that the woman reading quietly in his living room was already mentally living in Seattle, building a career that would make his betrayal irrelevant and planning a future that didn't include him at all. The transformation was accelerating, and soon, Garrett was going to discover that the comfortable life he had taken for granted was disappearing as surely as his wife's willingness to pretend that their marriage still existed. The systematic unraveling of Garrett's carefully constructed double life reached its tipping point over the following 2 weeks, as the infrastructure that had been supporting his affair began to collapse under the weight of his own contradictions.
and my strategic refusal to continue enabling his deception. The first crack in his facade came from an unexpected source, his workplace itself. Garrett had been using his position at Meridian Financial to facilitate his relationship with Vivienne, taking advantage of the flexible schedule that senior associates enjoyed, and the travel opportunities that provided cover for their romantic getaway. But his increased absences and distracted performance had begun to attract attention from supervisors who were less understanding than he had anticipated. I learned about this development through a chance encounter with Margaret Whitfield, the wife of Garrett's supervisor James Whitfield. I ran into Margaret at the grocery store on a Saturday morning, and what began as casual small talk quickly revealed that all was not well in Garrett's professional world. "How is Garrett handling the increased workload?" Margaret asked as we stood in the produce section, both of us selecting vegetables for the weekend. "James has been concerned about some of the newer associates, and whether they're adjusting well to the demands of senior-level responsibility." The phrasing of her question suggested that Garrett's performance had become a topic of discussion between James and his wife, which meant it was likely being discussed among the senior partners as well. "He seems to be managing," I replied carefully, "though he's certainly been working longer hours lately. I sometimes wonder if he's taking on too much, trying to prove himself worthy of advance." Margaret's expression shifted slightly, and I could see her processing my response in the context of whatever concerns her husband had shared. "That's interesting," she said slowly, "because James mentioned that Garrett has been missing some important meetings lately, and there have been questions about whether he's truly committed to some of the client relationships he's supposed to be managing." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Margaret delicately probing for information about Garrett's work habits, while I provided responses that were truthful but incomplete. By the time we parted ways, I understood that Garrett's affair was creating problems in his professional life that he had been hiding from me, just as he had been hiding the affair itself. That evening, when Garrett returned from what he claimed was a client consultation but was undoubtedly another hotel rendezvous with Vivienne, I decided to test what I had learned from Margaret. "James Whitfield's wife mentioned that you've been working incredibly hard lately," I said as Garrett helped himself to leftovers from the dinner I had made for myself. "She seemed concerned that you might be taking on too much responsibility." The effect of my comment was immediate and revealing. Garrett's face went pale, and I could see him mentally scrambling to assess what Margaret might have told me, and what implications that might have for his position at the firm. "What exactly did she say?" he asked, his casual tone undermined by the tension in his voice. "Just that James has noticed how dedicated you've been, working such long hours and taking on extra client responsibilities. She wondered if you might be overextending yourself." It was a masterful piece of misdirection. I had presented Margaret's concerns as praise for his dedication, while simultaneously letting him know that his supervisors were paying attention to his work pattern. Garrett had no way of knowing whether Margaret's comments represented genuine concern for his well-being, or professional scrutiny of his performance. But the real crisis began when Vivienne herself became a liability rather than an asset in their relationship. The strain of maintaining a secret affair while managing her regular duties as Garrett's administrative assistant had apparently begun to affect her professional performance as well. I learned about this development from an unexpected source. My own success at Brightwater Marketing had led to increased visibility in the local business community, and I had been invited to speak at a professional development luncheon, sponsored by the Meridian Chamber of Commerce. The event brought together business leaders from various industries, including several people from Meridian Financial. During the networking portion of the luncheon, I found myself in conversation with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a financial consultant who had been working with Meridian on client portfolio analysis. Elena was a sharp, observant woman who had clearly been paying attention to the dynamics within Garrett's office. "I've been working quite closely with your husband's department," Elena mentioned during our conversation about work-life balance and demanding careers. "He's fortunate to have such a dedicated assistant, though I have to say, Vivienne has seemed rather distracted lately during our meeting." The comment was clearly fishing for information, delivered with the careful tone of someone who had noticed irregularities, but wasn't sure how to interpret them. "Vivienne is very committed to her work," I replied with the neutral pleasantness I had perfected over recent weeks. Though I imagine managing Garrett's schedule has become increasingly challenging as his responsibilities have expanded. Elena nodded, but her expression suggested she was thinking about more than just scheduling difficulties. Yes, I've noticed that their working relationship seems quite intensive, very collaborative. Sometimes I wonder if the lines between professional and personal support might be getting a bit blurred. It was a diplomatically phrased observation that carried significant implication. Elena was essentially telling me that she had noticed inappropriate dynamics between my husband and his secretary, and she was giving me the opportunity to acknowledge or address those concerns. Instead of defending their relationship or expressing shock at the suggestion, I simply smiled and said, Garrett has always been someone who inspires deep loyalty in the people who work with him. I suppose that kind of dedication can sometimes appear quite personal to outside observers. The response was perfectly crafted to suggest that I was aware of the situation, but not concerned about it, which was probably more disturbing to Elena than any emotional reaction would have been. A wife who seemed unconcerned about her husband's inappropriate relationship with his secretary was either remarkably naive or remarkably strategic. But the most significant development came when Garrett's attempts to manage his double life began creating conflicts that he couldn't resolve through lies and misdirection. The crisis came to a head when he was forced to choose between attending an important client dinner that could affect his career advancement and meeting Vivienne for a romantic weekend that they had been planning for weeks. The client dinner was scheduled for Friday evening at the Meridian Country Club, hosted by the senior partners to celebrate the completion of a major acquisition deal. Attendance wasn't technically mandatory, but missing such an event would send a clear message about an associate's priorities and commitment to the firm. Garrett had known about this dinner for months and had originally planned to attend with me as his wife, but Vivienne had apparently booked a weekend getaway at a luxury resort in the mountains, expecting Garrett to join her for what she clearly considered an important milestone in their relationship. The timing conflict forced Garrett into the uncomfortable position of having to disappoint either his professional obligations or his personal commitment. I learned about his dilemma through a phone call from Linda Morrison, who was helping to coordinate the guest list for the country club dinner. I just wanted to confirm that you and Garrett will be attending Friday's celebration, Linda said during her call. I know how busy you both are, but James Whitfield specifically mentioned that he's looking forward to discussing Garrett's career trajectory with both of you. The implications were clear. Senior management wanted to evaluate Garrett as a potential candidate for advancement, and they expected to see him at this dinner with his wife, demonstrating his stability and commitment to the firm's social expectation. Of course we'll be there, I replied immediately. Garrett wouldn't miss such an important celebration. But when I mentioned the dinner to Garrett that evening, his reaction revealed the full extent of his predicament. Friday night, he repeated, his face showing a mixture of panic and calculation. Are you sure that's when it's scheduled? Linda Morrison called to confirm our attendance, I said, watching his expressions carefully. She mentioned that James Whitfield specifically wants to discuss your career prospects. It sounds like this could be important for your advancement. I could practically see the wheels turning in Garrett's head as he tried to figure out how to extricate himself from whatever commitment he had made to Vivienne without damaging his professional standing. Of course, he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. I'll just need to reschedule some other obligations I had that evening. Over the next few days, I watched Garrett struggle with the impossible logistics of trying to satisfy both his professional and romantic commitment. His phone conversations became increasingly tense and secretive, and I could tell that Vivienne was not taking the cancellation of their weekend plans well. The situation reached a breaking point on Thursday evening when Garrett received a phone call that was clearly from Vivienne and was obviously not going well. I could hear her voice through the phone, raised in anger and frustration, though I couldn't make out the specific word. Garrett's responses were defensive and increasingly desperate. You know I don't have a choice about this, he said at one point, pacing around our living room while trying to keep his voice low. It's not like I can tell them I have more important plans. Whatever Vivienne said in response caused Garrett's face to go white with what looked like genuine fear. Don't say that, he said quickly. You know that's not what this means. It's just one evening. We can reschedule for next weekend. But apparently one evening wasn't acceptable to a woman who had been promised a romantic weekend and was now being told that her lover's professional obligations took precedence over their relationship. The call ended with Garrett staring at his phone in obvious distress, and for the first time since I had discovered his affair, I almost felt sorry for him. He was discovering what every cheating spouse eventually learns, that maintaining multiple relationships requires constant compromise and sacrifice, and that eventually someone always gets hurt. As I watched him struggle with the consequences of his own choices, I realized that my strategic withdrawal had accomplished something I hadn't entirely expected. By forcing Garrett to manage his double life without my unwitting assistance, I had created a situation where his deception was becoming unsustainable through its own internal contradiction. He was about to learn that the comfortable life he had taken for granted wasn't just dependent on having a wife who didn't know about his affair, it was dependent on having a wife who actively helped him maintain the facade that made his deception possible. Friday evening was going to be very interesting indeed. Friday evening arrived with the kind of crisp December air that made the lights of the Meridian Country Club seem especially warm and inviting as we pulled into the circular driveway. I had chosen my outfit carefully for this evening, a sophisticated navy blue dress that conveyed both professional success and elegant femininity, paired with the diamond earrings Garrett had given me for our 5th anniversary, back when his gifts still carried genuine sentiment rather than guilty obligation. As we walked toward the club's entrance, I could feel the tension radiating from Garrett like heat from a furnace. His jaw was tight, his movements rigid, and he kept checking his phone with the compulsive frequency of someone expecting bad news. Whatever fallout he was experiencing from disappointing Vivienne was clearly weighing heavily on his mind, even as he tried to maintain the facade of a successful associate attending an important company celebration with his devoted wife. "You seem tense tonight," I observed as we approached the reception area, my tone carrying just enough concern to seem caring while remaining detached enough to avoid offering actual comfort. "Just work stress," he replied automatically, the standard deflection he had been using for months. "You know how these company events can be, a lot of pressure to make the right impression."
But as we entered the elegantly appointed dining room where the celebration was being held, it became clear that Garrett's stress had nothing to do with work performance, and everything to do with the phone that kept buzzing in his jacket pocket with what were obviously increasingly urgent messages from his mistress. The evening began pleasantly enough, with cocktails and networking conversations that allowed me to demonstrate why I was considered a valuable addition to these corporate social functions. I spoke knowledgeably with James Whitfield about the regional economic impact of Brightwater's expansion, shared insights about market trends with Elena Rodriguez, and even managed to have an engaging conversation with one of the senior partners about the challenges of balancing career growth with personal relationship. Meanwhile, Garrett struggled to maintain focus on the conversations happening around him. Every time his phone buzzed, his attention would drift, and I could see him fighting the urge to check his messages in the middle of important professional discussion. The contrast between my engaged presence and his obvious distraction was becoming increasingly apparent to the other attendees. The crisis escalated during dinner when Garrett's phone began buzzing with such frequency that he could no longer ignore it without appearing rude to our tablemate. Finally, he excused himself from the table, claiming he needed to take an urgent call from a client who was experiencing a time-sensitive crisis. "At this hour on a Friday?" questioned Margaret Whitfield, glancing at her watch with the expression of someone who knew that legitimate business emergencies rarely occurred during evening social events. "International markets," Garrett replied weakly, already moving toward the exit. "You know how it is with global trading schedules." But his explanation fell flat, particularly since everyone at our table knew that Garrett's client base consisted primarily of local businesses and regional investors who had no connection to international trading markets. He was gone for nearly 20 minutes, leaving me to navigate dinner conversation while fielding polite inquiries about his absence. I handled the situation with the grace of someone who was accustomed to making excuses for her husband's behavior, but I made no effort to provide convincing explanations for his disappearance. "Garrett seems to be dealing with quite a lot of pressure lately," Linda Morrison observed during his absence, her tone carrying the subtle probing that indicated she was fishing for information about what might be affecting his professional performance. "He's been working very hard," I replied with the diplomatic vagueness I had perfected over recent weeks. "Sometimes I think he takes on more responsibility than one person can reasonably handle. But you know, Garrett, he's always been someone who puts his commitments first, no matter what the personal cost might be." The response was technically supportive of my husband while simultaneously suggesting that his judgment about priorities might be questionable. Linda's expression indicated that she understood the subtext of my comment, and I could see her filing the information away for future reference. When Garrett finally returned to the table, his face was pale and his usual confident demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled agitation. Whatever conversation he had just finished with Vivienne had clearly not gone well, and he was struggling to transition back into the role of successful associate, celebrating with his colleagues. "Everything all right?" James Whitfield asked with the careful concern of a supervisor who was beginning to question an employee's stability. "Yes, of course," Garrett replied, but his voice carried an edge of strain that undermined his words. "Just a client situation that required some immediate attention." But throughout the remainder of the dinner, Garrett continued to receive messages that were clearly causing him distress. I watched him try to discreetly check his phone under the table, saw the way his face changed as he read whatever Vivienne was sending him, and observed his increasing inability to participate meaningfully in the conversations happening around him. The final crisis came during the dessert course, when Garrett's phone rang audibly despite his efforts to keep it silenced. The sound cut through the elegant conversation like an alarm, drawing attention from everyone at our table and several nearby tables as well. "I'm so sorry," Garrett said, fumbling to silence the call while his face flushed with embarrassment. "I thought I had turned it off." But before he could fully silence the phone, it began ringing again immediately, creating the unmistakable impression that whoever was calling was experiencing some kind of emergency that couldn't wait for a more appropriate time. James Whitfield's expression had shifted from polite concern to visible irritation, and I could see other senior partners exchanging glances that suggested Garrett's inability to manage his personal communications during a professional event was being noted and evaluated. "Perhaps you should take that," I suggested helpfully, my voice carrying just enough volume to ensure that nearby tables could hear my words. "It sounds like someone really needs to reach you." The suggestion was diabolical in its apparent supportiveness. By encouraging Garrett to take the call, I was giving him permission to further disrupt the evening while simultaneously drawing attention to the fact that he was receiving urgent personal communications during a company celebration. Garrett looked trapped, caught between the professional embarrassment of continued disruptions and whatever crisis Vivienne was apparently experiencing in his absence. Finally, he made the choice that revealed his true priority. "I'll just step outside for a moment," he said, already rising from his chair. "This will just take a minute." But as he hurried toward the exit with his phone pressed to his ear, I could see that his colleague's patience was wearing thin. Margaret Whitfield shook her head slightly, Elena Rodriguez looked genuinely concerned about his behavior, and James Whitfield's expression suggested that whatever evaluation of Garrett's advancement potential had been planned for this evening was not proceeding favorably. "I hope everything is all right," Linda Morrison said to me once Garrett had left the room. "He seems quite overwhelmed lately." "I think he's been struggling to balance all his various commitments," I replied, the words carrying multiple layers of meaning that I was confident Linda would understand. "Sometimes I worry that he's trying to be in too many places at once, if you know what I mean." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in subtle revelation and strategic positioning. Without ever directly stating that my husband was having an affair, I managed to convey to his colleagues and their spouses that Garrett was dealing with personal complications that were affecting his professional behavior and judgment. When Garrett finally returned to the table for the third time, nearly 30 minutes had passed, and the evening's formal program was concluding. His absence during the speeches and toasts had been noted by everyone present, and his obvious agitation was impossible to ignore. "I'm afraid we need to leave," he announced abruptly, not meeting anyone's eyes as he gathered his jacket. "There's been a family emergency that requires my immediate attention." The lie was so transparent, so obviously false, that several people at our table exchanged meaningful glances. Everyone present knew that Garrett's elderly parents lived in Florida and that we had no other family in the area who might require emergency assistance at 10 o'clock on a Friday evening. "Of course," James Whitfield replied, but his tone was cold and formal. "I hope everything works out." As we made our hurried exit from the country club, I could feel the eyes of Garrett's colleagues following us, and I knew that the evening had accomplished everything I had hoped it would. The careful professional reputation that Garrett had spent years building was crumbling under the weight of his inability to manage his personal crisis, and his colleagues had witnessed firsthand the kind of instability and poor judgment that would make them question his suitability for advancement. But the real devastation was yet to come. As we reached our car in the parking lot, Garrett's phone rang again, and this time, instead of stepping away to take the call privately, he answered it right there beside our vehicle. "What do you want me to do, Vivi?" he shouted into the phone, his voice carrying clearly in the cold night air. "I told you I couldn't get away tonight." I explained that this was important for my career. I stood quietly beside the passenger door, listening to my husband have an emotional argument with his mistress in the parking lot of his company's celebration dinner, and realized that the public exposure I had been orchestrating over the past weeks had reached its ultimate conclusion. Garrett's double life wasn't just unraveling, it was exploding in spectacular fashion, taking his professional reputation and personal dignity down with it. And the most beautiful part was that he had done it all to himself, simply by choosing his affair over his responsibilities and then being unable to manage the consequences of that choice. The woman he had underestimated and betrayed was about to show him exactly what it meant to lose everything you thought you could take for granted. The morning I found Garrett standing in our bedroom doorway with my suitcase had been carefully orchestrated from the moment I woke up at 5 a.m. While he was sleeping off what had clearly been a difficult night following his spectacular meltdown at the country club dinner, I had been systematically implementing the final phase of my strategic plan. 3 weeks had passed since the country club disaster, 3 weeks during which Garrett's professional and personal life had continued its accelerating collapse. James Whitfield had called him into a meeting the following Monday to discuss his recent performance concerns, and while Garrett had tried to downplay the conversation when he came home that evening, I could see that his position at Meridian Financial was now precarious at best. Meanwhile, his relationship with Vivienne had apparently reached a crisis point that required increasingly desperate attempts at damage control. She was no longer content to be the secret mistress who accommodated his schedule and accepted his excuses. According to the fragments of phone conversations I had overheard, she was demanding that he make a choice, either leave his wife and commit to their relationship publicly, or end their affair entirely. But Garrett, with the stubborn delusion of someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions, seemed to believe he could still salvage both relationships through some combination of manipulation and strategic delay. He had no idea that his wife had already made the choice for him. That morning, while Garrett was still asleep, I had completed the final arrangements for my move to Seattle. The Director of Strategic Development position had been finalized with a salary that exceeded my wildest expectations, a signing bonus that would cover all relocation expenses, and a start date of January 15th, exactly 3 weeks away. I had also finalized the purchase of a sleek downtown condo with panoramic views of Elliott Bay, using funds from the separate account I had been building over the past month. Most importantly, I had completed all the legal preparations for my departure. Patricia Caldwell had helped me file the divorce papers that would be served to Garrett later that afternoon, along with a comprehensive settlement agreement that was fair but firm. Given the evidence of his affair and the misuse of marital assets to support his relationship with Vivienne, Patricia was confident we could secure a favorable division of property that would leave me financially secure and independent. But before any of that legal machinery went into motion, I wanted to give Garrett one final opportunity to reveal the depth of his entitlement and delusion. So I had spent the early morning hours carefully packing his belongings, not just clothes, but personal items, books, electronics, and everything else that belonged specifically to him, into boxes that I stored in the garage. At the same time, I left my own suitcase prominently displayed on our bed, packed with a few essential items, and positioned so that it would be the first thing Garrett saw when he woke up. I wanted him to discover what he thought was evidence of my defeat and desperation,
to feel the rush of power that comes from believing you've successfully manipulated someone into submission. When Garrett finally emerged from our bedroom around 10 a.m., carrying my suitcase with that satisfied smile, I was sitting in our living room with a cup of coffee and my laptop, putting the finishing touches on my resignation letter to Brightwater Marketing. The letter expressed gratitude for the opportunities I had been given while announcing my transition to the Seattle position, and it would be submitted later that day along with a detailed transition plan for my clients and projects. "I see you found my suitcase," I said without looking up from my screen, my voice carrying the calm satisfaction of someone whose carefully laid plans were finally coming to fruition. Garrett's confident expression flickered slightly at my tone, which was not what he had expected from a woman who was supposedly being thrown out of her own home. "Delilah, I've been thinking about everything that's happened lately," he began, settling into what was clearly a prepared speech. "I realize that our marriage has become complicated, and I think it might be best for both of us if we took some time apart to figure out what we really want." The euphemistic language was masterful in its cowardice. Complicated, instead of destroyed by your affair. Time apart instead of I want to be with my mistress. What we really want instead of I've already chosen someone else. "That's very thoughtful of you," I replied, finally closing my laptop and giving him my full attention. "I'm glad you've been thinking about what you really want. It shows a level of self-awareness that I wasn't sure you possessed." The comment clearly confused him, as it was neither the angry confrontation nor the tearful pleading he had apparently expected. "I've arranged for you to stay at the Grandview Hotel while we work through the details," he continued, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "I've covered the cost for 2 weeks, which should give us both time to figure out the next steps." The condescending generosity was breathtaking. Here was a man who was essentially evicting me from our marital home so he could move his mistress in, and he was presenting it as a thoughtful gesture that I should be grateful for. 2 weeks at the Grandview," I repeated thoughtfully. "That's where you and Vivienne usually meet, isn't it? How considerate of you to book me into your regular trysting spot. I'm sure the staff will recognize the name when I check in." Garrett's face went pale, but he pressed ahead with his script. "I think this arrangement will be best for everyone involved," he said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when he wanted to shut down discussion. "It will give us space to work through our issues without the emotional complications of living together." "Issues," I repeated, savoring the word. "Is that what we're calling your year-long affair with your secretary? Issues?" For a moment, Garrett seemed genuinely surprised that I was speaking so directly about his infidelity. For weeks I had been operating through strategic withdrawal and subtle manipulation rather than direct confrontation, and he had apparently convinced himself that I was either unaware of his affair or willing to pretend it didn't exist. "Delilah, I understand you're upset, but I laughed, and the sound was genuinely amused rather than bitter. "Garrett, I'm not upset. I'm impressed. The sheer audacity of what you've just proposed is really quite remarkable." I stood up and walked to the window that overlooked our carefully maintained backyard, where the garden we had planted together in the early years of our marriage was now dormant for the winter. "Let me make sure I understand your plan correctly," I continued, keeping my back to him as I spoke. "You want me to move into a hotel room that you've graciously paid for, while you presumably move your mistress into our marital home. Then, after I've had time to figure out what I really want, which I assume means time to accept that you've chosen someone else, we'll work out the details of dissolving our marriage in a way that allows you to keep most of our shared assets, and avoid too much social embarrassment." When I turned back to face him, Garrett's expression suggested that my summary was uncomfortably accurate. "That's not. I mean, it's more complicated than that," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, it's not complicated at all," I replied, moving to the coffee table where I had placed a thick manila envelope earlier that morning. "In fact, it's remarkably simple." I handed him the envelope, watching his face as he opened it and began reading the divorce papers that Patricia had prepared with such meticulous attention to detail. "What is this?" he asked, though his expression made it clear he understood exactly what he was looking at. "It's what I really want," I said simply. "Complete dissolution of our marriage, division of assets according to state law, and formal documentation of your affair for the court record. Garrett's face cycled through a series of expressions: shock, anger, fear, and finally, a kind of desperate calculation as he tried to figure out how to regain control of the situation. "You can't be serious about this," he said, his voice rising for the first time. "Do you have any idea what a divorce will cost? What it will do to both our reputations? What it will mean for your financial security?" "Actually, I have a very clear idea," I replied, returning to my seat and reopening my laptop. "Patricia Caldwell has been very thorough in explaining my options and rights. As for my financial security, I'm not worried about that at all." I turned the laptop screen toward him, displaying the offer letter from the Seattle agency that detailed my new salary, benefits package, and signing bonus. "I accepted this position yesterday," I explained as I watched him read the terms of my new employment. "I'll be moving to Seattle in 3 weeks to begin my role as Director of Strategic Development for the Pacific Northwest region. The salary alone is more than you and I make combined in our current positions." For the first time since I had known him, Garrett looked genuinely speechless. The confident man who had walked into the room expecting to manage my departure on his terms was confronting the reality that his wife had not only anticipated his betrayal but had been planning her own strategic response for weeks. "You can't just leave," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of panic that I had never heard before. "What about the house? What about our life here? What about everything we've built together?" "Everything we built together was destroyed the moment you decided to build something with someone else," I replied calmly. "The house will be sold as part of the asset division. Our life here ended when you chose to start a new life with Vivienne. As for what we built together, well, you'll find that it's much harder to maintain when you don't have an unpaid wife managing all the details that made your comfortable life possible." I closed the laptop and stood up, gathering the personal items I had left strategically placed around the room. "The boxes in the garage contain your belongings," I continued. "I've arranged for a moving company to collect them this afternoon and deliver them to whatever address you provide. I'll be staying at the Meridian Plaza downtown until my move to Seattle is finalized." Garrett opened his mouth to speak, probably to argue or negotiate or make promises about ending his affair and rebuilding our marriage, but I held up my hand to stop him. "Before you say anything, I want you to understand something very clearly. This isn't a negotiation. This isn't a trial separation. This isn't an opportunity for you to choose between your wife and your mistress. This is the end of our marriage, implemented on my terms and according to my timeline." I paused at the doorway, looking back at the man I had once loved enough to build a life with, who was now sitting surrounded by legal documents that formalized the end of everything we had shared. "You wanted to know what I really want, Garrett. I want a life where I'm valued, respected, and treated as an equal partner. I want a career that challenges me and compensates me fairly for my contributions. I want relationships built on honesty rather than manipulation. And I want to never again waste my time on someone who thinks so little of me that they believe I'll accept being betrayed as the price of financial security." As I walked out the door of our house on Maplewood Drive for the last time, I could hear Garrett calling my name, his voice carrying a desperate edge that suggested he was finally beginning to understand what he had lost. But I didn't look back. The woman who might have been moved by his belated desperation was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to settle for less than she deserved. 3 months later, as I stood in my Seattle office, overlooking Elliott Bay, managing a team of talented professionals and building marketing strategies that were being implemented across 3 states, I received a text message from Rachel. It contained a link to a local news article about Meridian Financial's recent personnel changes, including the departure of several associates who had failed to meet the firm's standards for professional conduct. Garrett's name was mentioned prominently in the article, along with details about his voluntary resignation following performance concerns and inappropriate workplace relationships. According to Rachel's follow-up message, he was now working for a much smaller firm across town at a significant reduction in salary, while Vivienne had apparently moved on to a relationship with one of Meridian's senior partners, who could offer her more security and status than a disgraced former associate. I deleted the messages without responding and returned to my work planning the expansion strategy that would take our agency into the Canadian market within the next year. The woman who had once defined herself as Garrett Thornfield's wife was building something far more valuable, a life where betrayal was impossible because her happiness didn't depend on anyone else's choices. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying your enemy, it's about building something so magnificent that their betrayal becomes irrelevant to your success. And as I watched the sun set over Puget Sound from my corner office, I knew that I had achieved something far better than revenge. I had achieved complete and total freedom. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.